Muchas gracias. Good morning, everyone. Just a note that this session will be in both English and in Portuguese. If you would like translation devices, they are in the back that you may pick up. Just testing for our translator. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Let's get started with this exciting session, and we will have folks joining us throughout the session. Thank you all so much for being here for today's conversation on democracy in two of the Western Hemisphere's largest and most consequential democracies, the US and Brazil. On the surface, these two countries look quite different. The US is a federal republic with a two-party system and 250-year-old democratic institutions. Brazil is younger, and with a multi-party system, a powerful legislature, and a proportional representation model that produces coalition governments. One country conducts elections over months, some might say years. The other wraps them up in a single day with near universal participation. But there are also similarities. Both nations have experienced serious threats to democratic norms from within. Both are grappling with deep affordability and economic insecurity. Both have seen the rise of authoritarian populism, the weaponization of disinformation, and deep tensions between democratic institutions and the leaders who occupy them. So today's conversation is really about the heart of what this conference is about. What lessons can we learn from each other, and what does solidarity look like amongst democratic champions? So I am thrilled to be joined today by an amazing panel. Neera Tandon, President and CEO of the Center for American Progress, has for decades brought thought leadership to the intersection of policy, politics, and progressive governance. Senator Chris Murphy is a leader in the U.S. Senate on democracy and foreign policy and an adamant champion of anti-corruption and accountability as directly impactful to healthy democracy. Pedro Abramove, Vice President of Programs at the Open Society Foundations, brings a hemisphere-wide perspective on rights, justice, and democratic resilience. And Edinho Silva, leader of the PT, the Workers' Party of Brazil, offers us a frontline view of what it takes to defend and rebuild democracy after it's been tested to its limits. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. To start us off, Senator Murphy, you have warned that American democracy is boiling slowly to death, and suggested that the Trump administration's assaults on democracy are a symptom of a deeper crisis, the abandonment of the common good as our country's organizing principle. In a fragmented and polarized, distrustful environment, rife with corruption, and leaving behind traditional checks and balances, how do we bring the proverbial water below that boiling point?
Well, great to be here with all of you and excited for a conversation in which we compare and contrast notes on how we save and protect democracy in our hemisphere. So thanks to the organizers for bringing this really important conference together. Kamala Harris ran a good campaign under very difficult circumstances. And the centerpiece of her campaign was the protection of American democracy. And I think people were shocked that so many Americans, faced with a candidate who was openly campaigning on protecting American democracy, running against a candidate who was fairly openly campaigning on destroying American democracy, that the American people chose the candidate who was promising to break it into pieces. And I think the reason for that is somewhat simple. Americans are not terribly excited to protect this version of democracy. This version of American democracy has been captured by elites and corporations and billionaires. It has left millions of workers working, but feeling no dignity in their work, feeling alone in a very cold modern society. And they were willing to entertain a candidate who was promising to break it all down to the studs and rebuild it again. And so I think it is really important for us to understand that our party, our movement in America, will not have legitimacy unless it is revolutionary in its ideas about how to reorder our economy and how to reform our democracy. Our ideas have just been far too small. They have not met the moment. Many of our ideas have just been essentially writing checks to people to paper over the underlying injustices of the economy. We haven't talked much at all as a party in America about reforming democracy. My party used to talk all the time about getting billionaire and special interest money out of politics and out of elections. We rarely talk about that any longer. And people know that the corruption of our economy is downstream of the corruption of our democracy. The final point I'll make is this. You referenced the comments I've made about the underlying spiritual crisis in America. And people in America are feeling angry and anxious. They're feeling lonely. They're feeling disconnected. They don't feel like they know how to access meaning and purpose any longer. One of the things that Donald Trump does is he creates community. MAGA is a community. That's why a lot of people are drawn to it. He talks all the time about power, about restoring power to government. That's what tariffs are about. That's what the wall at the border is about, making government powerful again. And I think we have to understand the ways that people are feeling in our country. They are feeling powerless. They are feeling lonely. And if we just talk about economic plans, plans to reduce costs, but we don't talk about ways to make people feel more powerful and more connected, then I don't think we're going to meet this moment. So it's a really important time for us to be sharing stories with our friends in the Hemisphere, but also here in Europe, to understand how we message a robust, pugilistic progressivism that meets this moment.
Thank you, Senator. I'd love to press the point about power a little bit. Neera, we know that Donald Trump is not an aberration, right? That this is not happening in a silo. We've seen under in Brazil under Bolsonaro, in Hungary under Orban, in El Salvador with Bukele, that presenting yourself as a strong man who can address the feelings of insecurity, of loneliness, by promising delivery of security and prosperity no matter at what cost, is part of the authoritarian playbook, and one that has actually been really successful around the world for the far right. So how do you address that and build impactful and winnable strategic opposition that moves people if the far right has changed the rules of how we play the democratic game?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. And I think I would love to just build on Senator Murphy's remarks, which is, I think he is absolutely right that there is not just an economic crisis for Americans, but a spiritual or loneliness crisis, or a sense of lack of community, which is driven by the technological change. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there is still yet an economic crisis that people feel, that it is not just, that is a core component of what is creating a level of anger in the United States. I think it is all of the above, but the economics are a core part of that. And I think what's really crucial about the example of Trump is that in his second term, his policies are essentially hurting the people who voted for him the most. So, of course, Senator Murphy and others have spoken eloquently about the level of corruption that we are seeing in America today, that the president's policies basically serve the people who are willing to pay him bribes or fund his campaigns. And that is definitely part of the authoritarian playbook. So he learned a lot of lessons from Orban. But it's also crucial to remember that his policies have been directed at the people bearing the burden of his policies are working class people. The tariffs are essentially a form of a national sales tax on working class people. They pay it disproportionately. Everyone pays it, but they pay it disproportionately. His budget plans ensured that for the first time, a president put forward ideas where Americans will lose health care. No Republican president in our history has ever driven health care, ensured people lose coverage. 20 million working class Americans will lose health care coverage. And of course, the Iran war is terrible for a number of reasons, but it is hurting working class people in the United States. And I think this is a crucial lesson that authoritarian populists are a con. They speak the language of working class people, drive up fear and anger, and yet in our example, in issue after issue after issue, in every decision, the decisions are taken for the wealthiest at the expense of working class people. And so I think that is an important part. I agree with Senator Murphy. It is not the whole picture of what is driving anger in the United States. I do believe there is also a sense that the social fabric has just frayed, and there's a lot of work to do in that space. But I believe also that there is an opportunity for progressive politics, for the Democratic Party, to advocate and be the champion for working class people based on policies they put forward.
Thank you, Neera. I think what's really interesting is saying the authoritarian playbook is a con. And Edinho, you have been one of the architects of one of the most important pushbacks against that con in Brazil with President Lula's election in 2022. We are seeing other successful movements, as we mentioned in Hungary, recent referenda wins in Ecuador against Noboa, focusing on rebuilding trust with voters and governing towards tangible results in people's daily lives. What tactical lessons do you think Brazil has to share with the world about how democracies should be fighting back, given the comments from Senator Murphy and Neera, and how we build that into long-term sustainable support for our movements and ideas that are not just about one election, but about really bringing democracy back domestically and regionally?
Primeiramente, eu penso que nós estamos vivenciando um momento histórico muito importante, e aquilo que nós construirmos nesse momento certamente vai definir os rumos do mundo no próximo período. Então, essa reflexão que nós estamos fazendo sobre a democracia e sobre para onde a democracia vai, se ela vai para algum lugar, é um debate extremamente importante, e esse evento aqui eu penso que ele é crucial nesse sentido. Primeiro, para contextualizar nessa comparação Brasil e Estados Unidos, eu sou daqueles que pensa que nós temos mais afinidades com os Estados Unidos do que se imagina. A formação socioeconômica brasileira é muito semelhante à formação socioeconômica dos Estados Unidos. Evidente, considerando a realidade econômica, considerando a potência bélica que se tornou os Estados Unidos, a capacidade de disputa hegemônica, mas do ponto de vista cultural, da formação da identidade de país, nós temos muitas semelhanças e claro, a força dos Estados Unidos num país como o Brasil é muito grande, é significativo. Eu penso que eu não tenho nenhuma divergência com o senador, nem tampouco com a Nera, quando, na minha avaliação, a crise da democracia que nós estamos vivenciando, ela é consequência de uma crise longa do capitalismo. Nós entramos numa crise do capitalismo em 2008, eu disse isso ontem na mesa que eu participava. Nós não conseguimos responder a essa crise, ela é uma crise, portanto, estrutural do capitalismo. Ontem, inclusive, dizia que entre as características dessa crise, uma característica fundamental é que ele é uma crise de superprodução, ou seja, a adoção das novas tecnologias na virada do século XX para o século XXI fez com que nós intensificássemos a nossa capacidade produtiva, utilizando uma quantidade menor de força de trabalho, ou seja, nós produzimos mais com menos força de trabalho, portanto nós produzimos mais reduzindo a base de consumo. Isso é uma crise sistêmica. Nós, portanto, estamos produzindo sem massa de consumo para corresponder a essa produção. E por isso que no Brasil é tão importante, e eu penso que esse é um debate internacional, a questão da jornada de trabalho. Ou seja, nós precisamos diminuir a jornada de trabalho para que a gente possa ocupar mais trabalhadores no processo produtivo, ampliando a base de consumo, que seria uma das respostas à crise do capitalismo que nós estamos vivenciando. A outra caracterização é a força e a velocidade da financiarização da economia. Ou seja, a financiarização da economia é um instrumento de concentração da renda. Portanto, efetivamente, nós estamos vivenciando uma crise do capitalismo, ou seja, os países não conseguem manter uma capacidade de aumento da produção de riqueza, nós estamos vivenciando um processo de concentração da renda e, evidente, isso gera um descontentamento na sociedade, isso gera uma descrença na sociedade, isso gera um sentimento antissistema porque o mundo está mais empobrecido e a renda mais concentrada. Os trabalhadores com menor capacidade de consumo, os setores médios com menor capacidade de consumo, as famílias sem perspectiva de planejamento de futuro. Então, efetivamente, a sociedade participa do processo eleitoral, mas a vida não muda. Nós elegemos parlamentares, elegemos presidentes, governadores, senadores, mas a vida não muda. Então, há uma descrença na democracia representativa. E é uma descrença que ela efetivamente coloca em xeque nesse momento a democracia, aumenta a capacidade de interlocução da ultradireita, porque a ultradireita captura o sentimento antissistema, oferece respostas populistas, respostas simplistas para uma crise que é estrutural. Eu não tenho nenhuma dúvida que esse ambiente antissistema, essa crise que é uma crise cíclica, a descrença da democracia como instrumento de resposta aos problemas que a sociedade vive, cria as condições objetivas para que o fascismo cresça, e o fascismo está crescendo no mundo. E na minha avaliação, o Trump é o maior líder fascista do século XXI. Eu não tenho nenhuma dúvida dessa caracterização. Se nós voltarmos na década de 20 na Itália, quando o Gramsci caracteriza o fascismo, ele caracteriza como pensamento autoritário a não aceitação do diferente e expansionismo territorial. Então, efetivamente, o Trump é um líder fascista e ele tem reproduzido uma concepção de enfrentamento à crise que o mundo vive, e nós temos líderes fascistas se espalhando pelo mundo todo. Eu penso que no Brasil nós estamos diante de um embate que para nós ele também é histórico. O sentimento antissistema ele permeia a sociedade brasileira. O sentimento antissistema ele dá a tônica da disputa política hoje no Brasil. O presidente Lula é o presidente com maior capacidade de entrega para a sociedade desde a redemocratização do Brasil da década de 80. Portanto, nós estamos com obras estruturantes, enfrentando problemas de saneamento básico, enfrentando o problema habitacional, fazendo reforma da renda, consolidando programas de inclusão social e, mesmo assim, a sociedade continua questionando o sistema. A sociedade continua questionando se esse governo responde aos seus anseios. Porque é evidente, por mais que se promova uma reforma da renda, o Brasil ainda é, entre as 20 maiores potências do mundo, o país com maior concentração de renda. Então, nós temos que efetivamente entender que não serão as entregas que vão fazer com que a disputa política prevaleça em prol da democracia. É efetivamente nós apresentarmos à sociedade um outro modelo de sociedade. Nós questionarmos o modelo de produção, o modelo de reprodução da riqueza, nós questionarmos o modelo de concentração da riqueza e, por consequência, nós temos que enfrentar o debate da renda, da democratização da renda. Eu penso que nós temos, portanto, que questionar, como já foi dito aqui, esse modelo de sociedade e a forma que esse modelo está organizado. E se nós conseguirmos apresentar para a sociedade respostas que sejam efetivas em relação às condições de vida dos trabalhadores e das trabalhadoras, a perspectiva de futuro da juventude, um modelo de mundo onde a gente consiga produzir e distribuir riqueza sem destruir a natureza, sem agredir os recursos naturais, tratando a questão da urgência climática como uma questão central, eu penso que nós efetivamente construiremos condições para que a gente debata a democracia. E eu não tenho nenhuma dúvida que a resposta à crise da democracia representativa é nós pensarmos instrumentos de democracia direta, onde a sociedade participe de forma direta do debate sobre o orçamento, do processo decisório sobre a execução do orçamento, do processo decisório, o que é prioridade e o que não é prioridade no gasto público. Ou seja, a sociedade tem que participar de forma efetiva do processo democrático para que ela valorize a democracia. A democracia não pode ser um conceito abstrato. A democracia tem que ser um conceito concreto na vida das pessoas e na vida efetiva da sociedade. Claro que não são respostas simples, mas eu penso que é um caminho para que a gente faça essa reflexão. Mas se nós não debatermos a crise econômica, a crise longa do capitalismo, efetivamente nós não estaremos debatendo a origem dos nossos problemas. E é evidente, não é a construção de um muro entre os Estados Unidos e México que vai responder à crise do capitalismo. Não é a perseguição aos imigrantes que vai resolver a crise do capitalismo, seja nos Estados Unidos, seja nos países europeus. Os imigrantes, a mobilidade humana existe porque a concentração da renda existe. A mobilidade humana existe porque nós temos países miseráveis, enquanto países concentram cada vez mais a renda.
Thank you, Edinho. I think what you're really talking about here is democracy based on justice and shared conditions of opportunity. Pedro, you have deep experience in advancing equity, safety, security, and justice at the national level through your time in Brazil's Ministry of Justice. Strongmen around the world, as we just heard, use these same impact areas, right? The economic crisis, the crisis of spirit inside of countries to acquire, consolidate, and then keep power. If El Salvador's greatest export to the region is punitive populism, and Trump's greatest export is, is right, can Brazil's greatest export be inspiration of justice and delivery-based populism?
Thank you, Ali. It's such an honor to be here with Nira, one of the architects of this event. Senator Murphy's certainly one of our inspirations in the fight against authoritarianism in the world, and of course, Ginho, president of Workers' Party, someone that has also built a lot in terms of sustaining Brazilian democracy. Of course, I hope Brazil can be that exporter. I think but the most important point, I think, is understanding that some of those issues, particularly, I would say, the fight against crime in the perspective that Bukele in El Salvador is doing, which is absolutely, a massive violation of rights. And of course, with debatable, at least, effects in terms of what is exactly working in the country. The main risk that we see, I think, in the left is that we can think that it's possible to replicate those ways of dealing with crime and convincing people that it is a perspective, pro-democracy and from the left. When we play in the authoritarian field, we are playing their game. When we play when we try to mimic, right, and to impersonate authoritarians and far righters, people don't believe us. And of course, if that's the choice, okay, now in Brazil, there is, of course, a crime problem in Brazil, but if the response is we're going to import the Bukele model, right, and same thing for the U.S., right, and to our cities or to, they're better, right, in being the far right. I think there are two lessons for us on this. One is, are there responses that we can give that are concrete but come from a different perspective? And there is something interesting happening right now in Brazil that I think we should use an example, which is one of the main problems that Brazil is facing right now in terms of violence is violence against women, particularly murders against women and feminicides. And that's an approach that the government's now taking, putting that as the center of the crime reduction perspective, because the far right cannot, embody a speech of protecting women's rights. Not even if it is against crime, right? And so for me, that's one of the kind of things that it's important to shift. But of course, it goes beyond that, right? And we need to give responses for the things that they are strong, and migration and crime, but we need to mobilize the spirits and the minds around the issues that are important for us. Economic justice, as we said here, taxing the rich, that are very important. And I think in order to do that, I think the second lesson that I think it's important, and we've seen that in many parts, is that we can't just, the idea of politics that will go to meet people where they are, right, this is not politics, right? This is just kind of people being driven by pollsters, right? And good politicians are able to transform the vision and the spirit of the country. When United States, was not Trumpist before Trump arrived. Brazil was not Bolsonarista before Bolsonaro arrived. Those were politicians that were able to transform a vision of a country and get people that will never imagine to be adhering to those values, being able to kind of speak out loud about those things. It is, if we want to dispute a our societies, we need to know that we need to also convince people about new dreams that we're able to inspire. I think based on exactly, I won't repeat, of course, the economic roots and the causes, right, that are there, the anxieties that people are feeling, and our response won't come from polls. It will come from the kind of politician that I think Senator Murphy is, and is having the ability to do that. And of course, President Lula too, right? In terms of being able to articulate a vision of future for the country that is around economic, reducing economic inequality, that is around giving stability, but also creating a sense of solidarity among people that is new. And just to end, I think the element that I think is new for the possibility of thinking about this dream is sovereignty. That I think also exactly because of Trump, and I think it's a favor, right, that Trump is doing for a lot of our countries, the idea of sovereignty is now being able to be reclaimed by a lot of our countries. And the lesson here is also not to talk about sovereignty in the nationalist, excludent way that the far right does, but the opposite. Being able to talk about sovereignty, an inclusive sovereignty, and sovereignty that is the idea that we share the common destiny by being in the same country under the same flag, and then we need to think together what this country will be in the future, right? And then we can rally around the flag, around the values that we think that we know are important for people. And I think that's also much more. That's the export material I think that we need to have right now.
Thank you, Pedro. I think we've talked a lot about how the economic crisis around the world is a crisis of democracy. Senator Murphy and Edinho, you both touched upon in your remarks about the fact that if we don't tackle people's control over their own lives, they're never going to trust government again. Senator Murphy, you've said that the American people are at a breaking point on this issue. Edinho, President de Silva has said that the Workers' Party has to be more present inside of people's lives. Can you tell me a little bit about the political strategy, both in the U.S. And in Brazil, to become present while you're also balancing the political and fiscal constraints of your own systems? So we'll go to Senator Murphy first, and then we'll go to Edinho.
Well, I think it's required for us to present ideas that are as big as the problems that people face. Listen, we as a party became addicted over the years to relatively minor market adjustments. Pushing the incentives this way or that way to try to solve people's problems. The Affordable Care Act, something that I supported, something that has helped millions of Americans, was an example of a piece of legislation that basically used the existing broken market in order to solve a problem. And I think we are at a moment where people want us to confront the very nature of the market structure instead of nibbling around the edges. So for me, this involves thinking in very big, bold ways about, for instance, what a minimum wage should be in the United States. We have been conditioned to believe that you can only inch the minimum wage up a couple dollars at a time. We should be unapologetic in the United States that a minimum wage should be a living wage, and that realistically that's $20 to $25 an hour. That's not a rich man's wage in America, but it would actually make people feel like they're in control of their lives again. People don't want checks to paper over the unfairness of the economy. They want work to pay again. And I think that it also speaks to being bold in our vision about what we're going to do with AI, which is right now driving so much of the anxiety in the United States. They know that it's going to kill a lot of jobs, but they also wonder what's going to happen when the basic things that make us human, friendship, conversation, creativity, problem solving, get outsourced to machines. And the crisis of democracy is acute today. Imagine how much worse it will get if we have no real response to how to protect people from both the economic and spiritual disintegration that will come from these new technologies. And wouldn't it be so much better if the progressive movement worldwide had a coordinated response to how we are going to protect you economically and spiritually from this new technology? And that solution is going to have to be bold. It's going to have to be big. It's going to have to be confrontational to the technology industry. There is no solution that will protect people that the technology industry is going to sign on to. And the only way that we can win that fight, for instance, with the technology industry is to be united in the Hemisphere, to be united with Europe. So to me, it really is about envisioning big solutions. And I think that's easier to do if the global progressive community is thinking and working on those fights together.
Over to you.
Não são respostas simples, né? De fato, é um momento complexo e que vai exigir muito de nós, mas eu penso que nós temos que buscar caminhos e ir construindo as soluções. Eu penso que só uma forma de nós recuperarmos a credibilidade da democracia é se nós dialogarmos, de fato, como o senador enfatiza, sobre os problemas reais que a sociedade vivencia. Não adianta nós falarmos que o mundo vive uma crise econômica estrutural. As pessoas não conseguem materializar o que é uma crise econômica estrutural. Mas quando nós falamos que 1% do mundo detém 20% da renda, as pessoas entendem. Quando nós falamos que 50% do mundo detém 10% da renda, as pessoas entendem. As pessoas conseguem entender que esse mundo está injusto. Se você tem 1% da população mundial detendo 20% da renda, se você tem 10% da população mundial detendo 50% da renda, as pessoas conseguem entender que esse modelo de sociedade não nos serve. Eu me lembro, e o senador e a Nera podem me ajudar, em 2017, logo após a derrota da Hillary Clinton, eu li uma entrevista do Obama que para mim foi uma entrevista histórica, onde ele diz que a crise econômica havia derrotado o conceito de globalização. Ou seja, a concepção de que o mundo seria globalizado havia sido derrotado. Ou seja, ali, essa entrevista, ele fazia um reconhecimento de que nós teríamos uma ascensão da concepção de Estado Nacional como o motor do desenvolvimento econômico. Mas era mais complexo que isso. Nós viveríamos a ascensão do nacionalismo em pleno século XXI, só que um nacionalismo com inspiração fascista, porque ele é xenofóbico, ele traz junto com a xenofobia a homofobia, a misoginia e toda uma agenda de direita elencada no preconceito e na discriminação. Então, efetivamente, a crise econômica, ela criou as condições, né? No Brasil, nós temos um dito popular que ele diz assim: se faltou farinha, meu pirão primeiro. Ou seja, se o mundo está mais pobre, a América para os americanos, a Espanha para os espanhóis, a França para os franceses, a Alemanha para os alemães, a Itália para os italianos e assim por diante. Ou seja, se o mundo está mais pobre, que a riqueza fique para os meus. E isso, efetivamente, é uma resposta simplista para uma crise estrutural que a economia vivencia, mas essa banalização da resposta traz uma agenda que efetivamente enfraquece a democracia. Enfraquece a democracia e enfraquece as instituições. Ou seja, se nós pegarmos, eu estou falando aqui como observador, o senador Murphy e a Nera sabem muito mais que eu disso, mas como observador, a primeira eleição do Trump, a grande bandeira eleitoral, a construção de um muro para que os imigrantes não entrem nos Estados Unidos. A segunda grande bandeira no retorno do Trump, perseguição aos imigrantes. Perseguição aos imigrantes. Ou seja, não se debate a crise econômica, não se debate por que a condição de vida dos americanos piorou, não se debate por que a capacidade de consumo dos americanos piorou, e não se debate efetivamente a solução para os problemas, que é uma política de distribuição da renda, de um novo modelo econômico. Então, só há um caminho para que a gente recupere a democracia. Primeiro, um debate franco com a sociedade sobre o porquê que o mundo está mais pobre, porquê que as famílias estão mais pobres, porquê que a juventude tem menor perspectiva de futuro, porquê que efetivamente o ambiente está piorando em decorrência da crise econômica. Se nós debatermos de forma franca, efetivamente nós estaremos debatendo o problema. E claro que a democracia, ela é um instrumento de resposta. Repito, a crise que nós estamos vivendo é uma crise da democracia representativa na concepção que nós construímos no século XX. Porque nós tínhamos a concepção que democracia é quando a sociedade tem o direito a falar o que pensa, a se organizar, a se manifestar, e o direito de ir às urnas, escolher os seus representantes. O que o século XXI está mostrando para nós é que a democracia tem que ser mais que isso. Eu uso uma metáfora que é como, no caso do Brasil, nós estivéssemos num estádio de futebol onde a torcida estivesse assistindo o jogo. Nós vamos recuperar a democracia se a gente falar para a torcida, entre e jogue, participe do jogo, participe do processo. Nós temos muitas experiências no mundo de democracia direta. O Brasil vivenciou e vivencia muitas experiências de democracia direta, como o que nós chamamos no Brasil do orçamento participativo, quando a sociedade participa da escolha do que é prioridade na execução orçamentária. Se é a saúde, se é a educação, se é a assistência social, se é a cultura, se é o esporte, se é a construção de uma escola, se é a construção de uma unidade de saúde, se é a construção de uma área de lazer, se é o financiamento de um programa cultural. Eu não sei se essa é a resposta, mas me parece que essa pode ser uma das respostas ou um caminho para a construção das respostas. Eu tenho dialogado muito com o presidente Lula nesse sentido. Claro que quando você leva para a esfera federal, é muito difícil você pedir para a sociedade opinar o que é mais importante. Eu digo, presidente Lula, é difícil, mas não é impossível. Claro que quando você debate isso numa cidade, num município, é mais fácil. Você materializa de forma mais simples, porque a sociedade vai se organizar, vai escolher o que é prioridade e ela vai ver a escola ser construída, a creche ser construída, a unidade de saúde ser construída. Mas na esfera nacional é possível sim nós consultarmos o que é importante para a sociedade no investimento do orçamento público. Quais as áreas que nós temos que priorizar no investimento do orçamento público? Então eu penso que diante da gravidade da crise que nós estamos vivenciando, não há uma resposta pronta, não há uma resposta acabada, mas há caminhos que nós podemos trilhar e seguir nele construindo respostas. Mas eu não tenho nenhuma dúvida que nós só responderemos à crise da democracia se a sociedade se sentir parte do processo democrático. E certamente nós teremos que fazer reformas institucionais para que a gente responda a essa crise da democracia. Reformas no modelo político, reformas no poder judiciário, reformas nas nossas instituições para que efetivamente o Estado esteja mais próximo da sociedade civil, para que a sociedade civil se sinta mais controladora do aparelho de Estado, né? Porque efetivamente nós só respondemos a crises estruturais com reformas estruturais. Não há outro caminho. E a crise que nós estamos vivendo é uma crise estrutural da economia, que a materialização dela é o volume da concentração da renda, e a crise que nós estamos vivendo é uma crise estrutural do modelo de democracia que nós concebemos no século XX. Portanto, serão reformas estruturais que darão respostas a essas crises estruturais.
Thank you, Edinho. We'll do one more quick question, and then we'd love to take questions from the audience before we all head to lunch and to the rally. I'd love to build a little bit on this metaphor of we're all in a soccer stadium and let's get out of the stands and onto the field. Nira and Pedro, civil society is really where democracy lives between elections, right? It's how we're organizing people, it's how we keep people engaged, where the ideas are coming from. For our folks here in the audience and as they're going back to their organizations and their domestic contexts, what's the homework? What is the work we should be challenging ourselves to do coming out of convenings like this, wherever we are on the journey for democracy, whether we're building it, we're protecting it, or we're recovering it?
Well, I think maybe what I'll do is respond to the comments, and then, because I think actually all of our work is to try to build back up our democracies. And I think I want to agree and kind of slightly disagree with some of this from some of the remarks. I think all of us would say, and I agree I agree vociferously with the idea that our economies are not producing at a fundamental level in the following sense, which is that in the United States, our economic infrastructure is really from the 1930s. Some of it is from the 1960s. And essentially our social contract was built, during the Great Depression, basically the New Deal architecture. That has been eroded by the far right, first with the rise of Reagan, second with the rise of Trump, and we need alternative models. In the United States, we have people deeply pessimistic. Consumer confidence is at a 70-year low. That is a historic fact. So I think that reflects a deep pessimism that people have about, whether their kids will be better off than them. 75% of Americans think that their kids will be worse off than them, which tells me that the basic social contract between the citizen and business, the citizen and the state, is really not producing for the vast majority of people. And we have to think of new requirements, not just a living wage, but how are companies actually producing not a minimum wage, but wages themselves? How's the state encouraging economic success for multitudes of people, whether that's requirements of sharing profits, other structures? I think we have to think boldly about that. I also think, I just want to speak to the Senator's focus. I think it is really true that people feel a lack of control. And I think that AI companies and social media both foster that sense of lack of control and create polarization by the kind of algorithms of hate, but make people feel much less secure. But I also think we should recognize that when people feel like they lack control, issues of order matter to them more. And if we want to be really clear-eyed, in the United States, working class people are very focused on how impossible it is to make ends meet, but we need to be honest with them as well, honest with ourselves, that they also care about order. They see the lack of order on social media, I'm sure, but they also see a lack of order when they look at the border and at crime. And I think we have to be genuine in realizing we do not need to return to the failed policies of the past, but we have to give an answer about how we are responding to the need for order. And I think that if we want to preference working class people over elites, we have to meet them both on economics, personal security, and this sense of lack of order and community.
Pedro, any thoughts here?
I think one of the most positive aspects of vibrant democracies, as we do have in the U.S. and in Brazil, is the possibility of a tension between civil society and the political environment, a positive one. And that tension should realize that there are different roles, right? Of course, we need a political system that is open to civil society, and we need civil society that understand the role of politics in life and in transformation. But we also need civil society that never lose the ability to inspire people, right? And we've seen in both countries a lot of the ideas that can mobilize people that many times have been incorporated by politicians. They appear and they are created in the civil society space. The worst thing that can happen is when we have a civil society that is afraid to innovate and criticize because they're thinking about the risks of the political speech. That's the politician's job, right? Take Max Weber, ethics of conviction and ethics of responsibility. Each one has its role. But if we lose the ethics of conviction, if we lose the ability to kind of reimagine and think big, then it is impossible to really rethink the dreams or reimagine new dreams. I think Brazil recently, there were a lot of issues that appeared first coming from civil society, right? From outside, the labor reduction of the journey, right? That is now one of the most important things of in Brazil. In Brazil, we have 6 days of work and 1 day of people, are allowed to work on Saturday and not being paid for that. And we are the President Lula is proposing to reduce to kind of a 5 days weeks. And this came not from kind of the Ministry of Labor. The discussion started from civil society, from the group of workers, from outside. And I think what's beautiful to see is when the government take an idea like that and say, let's make it policy, right? But if the civil society is afraid to innovate because they think it's too risky, then the imagination will never move. So I think that relationship between civil society and politics is at the key of the possibility of reimagining a future and disputing those kind of dreams and minds and hearts of people with the far right.
Can I just say one thing about this very, very briefly, which is I do think in the United States we have seen a lot of civil society, particularly foundations, very fearful of being attacked or undermined. I want to say Open Society Foundation has been different and courageous, but even in our year and a half, you see foundations that are exiting the political process, exiting the policy process for fear of being targeted, and it is extremely corrosive and undermining to all institutions that are trying to do ideas work or organizing or just save democracy itself.
We'll take the last minute or two for questions, and then we'd love to thank our panelists. Any questions from the audience?
Okay.
Right here, in the blue.
Thank you. I don't like to think of democracy in a vacuum, and I try to imagine being a democracy domestically without having a democratic foreign policy. And I was looking at Brazil, where Lula has stood up for international law. Looking at Trump, well, definitely an acceleration. seeing Trump as an acceleration, but not really an exception to a long history, a bipartisan history of a militaristic foreign policy in the United States. So I was wondering what kind of bold responses on the foreign policy front could be proposed to link that domestic democracy to a more democratic way of being in the world.
Well, I mean, right now we're in we are in a multitude of crises of democracy in the United States right now, but one of them is runaway executive war making. We are engaged in a full-scale war with Iran right now that is spilling over into the region that the American public does not want. And so if you want additional evidence for why Americans are scratching their heads and wondering whether this version of democracy is worth protecting, it's because maybe the most sacred power that the people thought they had, the decision as to whether to go to war, to send our men and women overseas to die for our security, has been taken from them by an executive who has captured that power and by a feckless Congress that has refused to check the president. So I do believe that one of the repairs we need to make to our democracy is to strengthen the hand of the branch of government most directly connected to the people, Congress, to rein in the president's ability to conduct war and military exercises all over the world. I also think we're going to need to dramatically shift the way that we spend money inside our national security toolkit to spend more money on peace. And less money on war. That means rebuilding USAID. That means helping our neighbors with counter-propaganda programming. That means economic development throughout the world. But I think at the center of our repair process for our democracy is going to be to give the people more say when it comes to deploying the U.S. military overseas, or frankly, providing aid to our allies who are taking part in military activities that the United States people don't support either. They want more power, they deserve more power, they're smarter than we give them credit for in terms of whether we should get involved in complicated conflicts overseas, and I think that will be an important conversation.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you for being with us today.
Thank you. I'd be fascinated to see it.
Definitely.
Thank you.